There are unique challenges that each business rescue practitioner has to deal with when conducting a business rescue. However, there are general challenges that are pertinent in the industry. Turnaround Talk caught up with Robin Nicholson, Director of Corporate 911, to discuss these challenges. While each business rescue is unique in that very few companies face the same challenges that lead to distress, there are common challenges that BRPs face. Please discuss these in more detail.
It's true that the same causes for distress arise time and time again in business rescue. An industry is in decline, a segment of the industry is collapsing, where there are external factors, and then there are internal factors that are also quite common. Badly run companies, a major debt has collapsed in the industry, and those things are going to happen whether you've got COVID or no COVID during the pandemic. Where you are seeing changes now is that more and more good companies are ending up in business rescue that would not have in the past.
How do BRPs overcome these challenges?
Look, business rescue gives you three big things. One, reprieve from litigation. Two, an ability to enter into a compromise agreement with your creditors. And three, time to recover and recapitalize your business. And your BRP has to utilize those together with negotiation skills and talking to customers and suppliers to formulate a business rescue plan. So he's got a couple of things that can help him overcome the challenges, but at the end of the day, he still has to end up with a transaction where parties agree that the company can be rescued, should be rescued, and that they're willing to participate.
You've been a BRP for several years now. Have these challenges evolved over time?
I think the understanding about how these challenges arise and can be met using the provisions of Chapter 6 has definitely matured. There are still some areas of Chapter 6 that we haven't explored properly. So compelled offers to minorities and that kind of thing. You know, we've had a couple of really bad court cases and it stopped part of the Chapter 6 provisions from moving forward until there's been a revision of the legislation. Or someone's had enough money to litigate the matter. But yes, there are ways of overcoming the challenges that are and have changed in the industry. I think there's also been some very bad outcomes in the industry. The uncertainty about practitioners' remuneration, how it shapes up in a liquidation, when you can bring liquidation orders. There have also been some very deleterious court cases in the labour environment where you can't retrench until you have a business rescue plan. But in fact, you've got to cut costs urgently. In some cases, it's quite apparent what needs to happen. And the BRP is endowed with the provisions in terms of the Act to take action to reduce the cost base of the company. And now the Act is, the courts have said, but that can only be done in terms of business rescue plan. And that clearly, in my view, is not right. That's actually quite wrong.
Technology is a major challenge, and most BRPs now have to build online practices. Do younger BRPs cope better with this adaptation than older BRPs?
No. I think that we've been in an age of technology now since the 1980s. Most BRPs grew up with sophisticated accounting systems, emails. I think what has changed is the human interaction using technology. And that is the same for young people as it is for old people. I think people, more senior BRPs, are much more used to developing relationships in a one-on-one environment. Younger BRPs might be more used to using digital means to develop their networks and their relationships. I think that's quite clear. You don't find too many people in their 60s on social media talking about their businesses, but you'll find most people are using LinkedIn. It's a platform to communicate. There's no giant leap forward in the technology during the pandemic.
Let's talk about accelerants. There are moments in time that can accelerate distress. COVID did this to Edgar's. What impact does COVID have on the industry?
Well, I think in terms of accelerating business rescue as an industry, it certainly has had a big impact. A lot more companies are entering into business rescue earlier than they would have in the past, and consequently are looking for different outcomes. The test for BRPs has always been, can you provide an outcome for providers of capital that's better than the liquidation? Now the expectation is that you can actually rescue the company and save it from a liquidation. So certainly it's accelerated the maturity of that in terms of companies entering into rescue. Perhaps 2 years ago we were on the brink of liquidation. Now they're much more trying to save the businesses. Having said that, the counterparty to that is that the need for post-commencement finance in business rescue has always been quite a significant part of any turnaround or any business rescue. That has not got any easier. In fact, in many cases it's got harder. Companies get into distress, banks withdraw funding, the company ends up in business rescue. Even though it's quite a viable business, it needs a short amount of capital, and there are no standby funds for companies of that nature. So if you're looking for between 5 and 10 million to see us through the next year, that's incredibly hard. If you're looking for 50 million, it's easier. So the SMEs and the medium-sized companies are feeling the real pressure from COVID-19 in terms of their funding alternatives. And as we get deeper and deeper into the pandemic, so the personal resources of directors and shareholders have been depleted, and they need incremental funding. And quite frankly, we've not provided sufficient response in the pandemic to that.
In your experience, if a company can predict an event or action that will put them in distress, how long does it take that company to make relevant changes to avoid this?
So the real issue is how quickly any company can get through its own inertia against change. So, there's the scientists will tell you with thermodynamics and everything tends towards inertia. In companies, you get two drivers of inertia. It's always been this way, it always worked this way, we've always got through. It's part of the business cycle. The pandemic has changed that. And people are battling at a personal level to deal with the pandemic, businesses even more so. They've had to change the ways they've worked. Their markets have moved away from them quite rapidly. They've lost senior executives, they've lost tiers of staff, they've been forced through retrenchments. The skills base are all over the place right now because they can't get teams together and do team building. Their communication structures around how people work together are not equivalent in a digital environment to actually walking through people through business processes and how they run their business, and reaching consensus is even more hard because it takes much longer to build a consensus about a way forward. So I think the most important thing for me as a rescue practitioner that this pandemic has shown is that the importance to businesses of their risk management strategies and appreciation is critically important. So if you were simply to take that and look at the coal industry, there was the belief that Donald Trump's reigniting the thermal coal industry in the US would help that industry. It didn't. The market reacted by saying, well, there'll be more coal, and the price of thermal coal dropped even further, and more coal mines became marginal. In this country, that pressed many of the exporters into some serious cost reductions. Add to that all of the other things that happened in our industry, the Guptas, the collapse of Optimum Colliery, none of which could have been predicted, but which were absolutely foreseeable if you took a point of view from a risk management point of view. What is rampant corruption going to do to my business? You would have said, well, I'd lose control of my pricing power with Eskom, and I'd be a price taker, not a price maker. What would that do to my business? How do I mitigate against it? So, in the 1990s, when South Africa was moving through its transition to democracy, a lot of money was invested by various stakeholders in developing scenarios and scenario planning. And Clem Sunter became quite famous for his book, Think Like a Fox, as an example. He said, you need to plan for the future using scenarios, what if analysis. And Shell did a lot of work around that. You don't see the same kind of forward thinking amongst corporates right now as they approach the pandemic. No one is coming out of the scenario for the country saying, this is what the pandemic will mean to you as an employer. This is what the pandemic will mean to you if you're looking for article clerks, for example. Accounting and law firms have contracted significantly. So those people that have built their careers and are going into articles of clerkship will simply find no work. When will that recover? The knock-on effect of that is, when will large and medium-sized accounting firms find the staff they need in 4 or 5 years' time? to actually do the audits that are required as the economy recovers. That's just the microcosm. I mean, if you look further down the line, who'd want to be a nurse right now? So there are going to be ripple effects from the pandemic that as a country we're not addressing from a risk mitigation point of view. With risk goes opportunity. You get into any business is the assumption of risk for profit. What risks you can take on. These kinds of major disruptions like pandemics are foreseeable, but because they're sort of 100-year events, no one takes them seriously until it's too late. But the response to that is to say, how do we plan now? What does the scenario look like? It is still very uncertain, and no one is coming out with leadership and guidance on what the future will look like, because quite frankly, no one knows.
Finally, skills in the average age of BRPs is an issue. Is business rescue an attractive profession for young professionals? How do we address this?
Well, I think as people get into the early stages of their professional career after they finish qualifying and finish their professional exams, they tend to drift into certain areas of their professions. So some will become accountants, some will become advisors, some will become financiers, others will become entrepreneurs, and they'll use their base core skills in those environments. Business turnaround and recovery has always stayed in the corporate finance, private equity, and consultancy sphere. Whether that's seen as business process re-engineering or turnaround and recovery or business rescue, there is a maturity and understanding of business and processes that will be built up by professionals over time. So you'll find that as this becomes more and more prevalent, the lawyers going through the legal firms with litigation and debt restructuring departments will come up with a better understanding of the law and of turnaround. Accounting firms have always had a private consulting practice with their core clients in the private space to help them grow their businesses. Banks will develop and hopefully outsource much of their debt restructuring and turnaround work that happens internally to the banks into business rescue practices as they develop more confidence in the profession itself and the ethics of the profession, and they build their own core set of skills. So yes, the rescue profession will find people entering into it from the accounting fields, from engineering, from general business, and from the banks as it becomes more formalized and stable going forward. It's not an industry that anywhere in the world is contracted. Companies will always be in distress, companies will always need turnaround, companies will always be well run, and equally companies will always be badly run. So the demand drivers behind rescue and restructuring are not going to change. The pandemic has added a new dimension to it and speeded up some of those causes. But that's all that's happened. The industry will continue to grow.